Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Killing for Coal, Big Business, Mine Workers, and the Struggle for Industrial Democracy and Human Dignity in the Fossil-Fueled West. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm pleased to be joining you tonight. I'm sorry that we started about a minute late. I had that same sensation that each of you have when in the mornings, kids are lining up outside your room and you're getting things together right at the last minute. So I was downloaded an updated PowerPoint. So Thomas, you can know that, in fact, everything is updated, and the slideshow that we'll use tonight is the last and final copy that you used. I want to thank my colleague Libby Taylor, who is working from home tonight and helped us pull that together and make sure that we had all of the current resources and documents that Thomas put in the PowerPoint available to you tonight. I also want to welcome Mike Williams to our team as the Education Project Manager. Any three of us can help you with any questions you might have about the work at the National Humanities Center, and in particular the education work that we do. So please reach out to us anytime by email or by Twitter. Let us know how this is going for you. Let us know if you have any suggestions or any thoughts on how we can make improvements. I also want to thank the National Council for the Social Studies for co-sponsoring tonight's session. NCSS is the largest professional association in the country that's dedicated solely to social studies education. I'm just now finishing my term as a member of the Board of Trustees. I can tell you that NCSS takes it very seriously, the advocacy work and the support in which we, on a national level, try to provide resources and try to make sure that you in the classroom have the kinds of support that you need. So I would encourage you to go to the website, www.socialstudies.org. I'd also encourage you to consider the annual conference that happens every fall. Next November, it'll be in Austin, Texas, and it'll mark the 100th anniversary of NCSS. Tonight's webinar is a PowerPoint-based and audio-only PowerPoint. I do want to say that if for some reason you have a hard time hearing, or if my voice isn't clear, and I can see every now and again somebody will type into the chat box that they can't hear, that's almost always on your end, so check your volume. And if for some reason it doesn't pull together, then feel free to go out, to close your window and then come back in. This webinar does depend on your participation. That chat box is the best way to do that. My job as the moderator is to keep an eye on the chat box, to bring in questions you might have, to ask for some clarifying remarks by our lead scholar. We may at times ask open-ended questions and invite your feedback. So please use that as often as you like and as you can. If you register a question and it scrolls out of view and I don't quite get to it in time, feel free to put it back in there and make sure that I bring your thoughts to the conversation. National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina. The center has been a retreat center for university professors for 41 years who come to the center in fellowship each year if they're selected to be a part of that cohort, and they advance humanities scholarship. We work with professors from all disciplines: history, literary scholars, philosophy, anthropology, you name it. And it's that scholarship, it's that deeper understanding of the humanities that form the basis of our education programs. Our goal is to create bridges so that that scholarship and that work in research can impact and affect classroom practice. We work with K-12 teachers, as many of you are. We also work with graduate students and community college educators and university educators as well. And ultimately, I think we aim to be a laboratory where experts in your fields, and I count every single one of you as, if not an expert, at least as a very experienced and very talented educator, to contribute to a conversation, to have a greater understanding of the humanities and the ways that they can serve as tools for understanding the world that we live in. Our education work then produces materials that are free and available to you as educators. We have a whole repository of classroom-ready lessons. We have primary source collections and kits, and we have teacher essays that are written by scholars that provide a scholarly view of different topics that allow you to grab those in bite-sized form and use it in your classroom. The webinar series has proven to be one of our more popular and frankly, one of the more fun things that we do. By inviting lead scholars like Thomas Andrews in for these conversations, we're able to invite our audience to look at pre-readings, to spend time, 90 minutes in the evening, work after work, to really dig into some of these topics, and also to discuss how we can then translate that to the classroom. I'm pleased to say that we've added a new webinar to our series this spring. Each year we do somewhere around 30 sessions, and sometimes there are topics that are just too compelling and too relevant, and I find a way to insert something there at the end. So we have added a new session. It just went live today. It's titled The Ethics of Gerrymandering, and we'll be working with Sheila Kennedy, who's a professor at law at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. As many of you know, our sessions tend to reach capacity pretty quickly, so I'd encourage you to go to our website and sign up for that webinar. It's scheduled for May 16th, which I think is a Wednesday. Go ahead and sign up now and make sure that you have access to that if you like. Each of our webinars are recorded and then archived in our YouTube channel. So after tonight's session, if you'd like to go back and play it and linger and pause and match it with the PowerPoint, then you'll have a chance to do that. Usually our recordings are online and live within about 2 days, about 48 hours. We have a lot of other resources that are also available to you. That includes a podcast series in which we ask scholars and educators to discuss the process of the work that they do. We also have a full slate of online courses. By next August, we should have as many as 8 to 10 different titles. Many of them are listed on the screen in front of you. These 5 to 6 weeks modules come with continuing ed credit, often between 25 and 30 hours. And it gives you a chance to really immerse yourself in different topics that we've addressed in webinars in the past. These are open and free to educators across the country. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look at our website for more information on them. Each year, a teacher advisory council works and contributes and serves the center by giving us insights to the real world of teachers and classrooms around the country. It's important for us that the work we do is relevant and applicable. It's important that we do not work in the silo of the National Humanities Center in the woods in North Carolina. I'm very pleased that all 15 of these educators have contributed greatly this year. I think Melissa Tracy is with us tonight somewhere in this room. And I do want to encourage any of you who have engaged us in our activities and would like to be more actively involved to keep an eye for the application process for 2019-20 school year, which should come live probably early next month, early April. If you go to our website, the webinar registration page, that is, you can also download a PDF form that will allow you to ask for prior approval from your administration to collect the certificates for each of the webinars that you participate in. This allows you just to put all that together and to make sure that your school will give you the appropriate credit when the time comes. At the end of tonight's session, when I close the room, you'll be invited to take a survey. And once you take that survey, you'll be able to download your certificate and be able to, again, turn that in for the kind of credit that your district, your school, your administration can offer. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Thomas G. Andrews, who's a professor of history at the University of Colorado in Boulder, to our webinar series tonight. Tonight's session is going to be based on his 2008 publication, Killing for Coal, America's Deadliest Labor War. And I think as we go through tonight, it's going to be clear that we're going to be offering a lot of different layers to this story. And I think my hope, our hope, is that some of the vignettes, some of the case studies can offer you as educators an insight into this complicated world that likely will have an environmental history and humanities angle. It will likely have a social or a labor angle. It'll likely have first-person story layer. But to me, it's a really interesting way to begin to understand something that we hear about quite a bit. So Thomas, I want to thank you for joining us, particularly knowing that the winter is hitting you hard there in Colorado. Thomas, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Fantastic. I think you're probably under snow right now. We appreciate you joining. I'm going to say this to you sort of in sidebar, although everyone's listening, and that is, if for some reason your internet or your system is disrupted, the sound is disrupted, in the audio tab, you can click phone call and then call in if your computer audio is not working.
Okay. Great.
Fantastic. So, Thomas, I've given you the mouse, and I'm anxious to hear you unpeel this story for us. Thank you again for joining.
Okay. Well, thanks, Andy. I want to thank Andy for inviting me to do this, and I want to thank Libby for putting up with me as I tried to get various versions of documents and the PowerPoint together. And most of all, I want to thank all of the teachers out there for being here. So I really appreciate you taking the time to learn more about the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Coalfield War and the larger historical context out of which they emerged. So I'm really excited to be with you tonight. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is drawn both from my book and from the document set that you all read. And the way I'm going to organize things is we're going to do a relatively focused pass on the 1913-14 strike itself, and that's going to take most of our time. And then we're going to back up and set these events in a longer context to try to understand the underlying causes and the sort of broader set of changes in which from which the Colorado Coalfield War really emerges. And throughout, I want to be clear about a few things I'm going to be doing. We're going to work, particularly in that first part, with several documents, and all of these documents are from the packet that that you all have access to. And so I hope that you'll, I'll have versions of the documents on the screen, but when you want head notes to put these documents in context, and when you want that kind of contextual material, all of that's available in the packet. Secondly, as Andy said, I'm going to take what I would consider kind of a relatively holistic approach. So I'm going to be drawing on social history, but I'm very much an environmental historian. We'll talk about politics, we'll talk about economics, and so this is going to be maybe a broader ranging conversation about American labor history than what you've heard before sometimes. And
Hey,
then
Thomas,
finally,
if you don't mind, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you and I have both used that term, environmental historian. Can you define that for us? What exactly makes you an environmental historian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that environmental historians are historians who pay attention to the other than human contexts in which human histories unfold. And so you can think of it as sort of history where nature matters. Environmental history in some ways comes out of an ecological approach where everything's connected. And so I'm always interested in trying to situate human events and human processes in a larger, often other than human set of processes and dynamics. So environmental historians look at environmental change. They look at the ways in which environmental endowments and possibilities structure but don't determine human history. And they also look at the politics that surround the environment in its various forms. And so tonight, the environment figures in most fully in terms of energy and fossil fuels. And one of the things I'm going to argue by the end is that we can better understand this labor conflict by paying attention to the environments in which miners worked. So this is going to be document heavy. It's going to be holistic, and I'm also going to try, at least on occasion, to try to make the case that all of this is incredibly relevant today. I live in Denver, and as many of you know, Denver's teachers were on strike last month, and there's so many aspects of this story of environmental change and of labor conflict in the southern Colorado coalfields that speaks to our present day context. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that relevance, and then I hope all of you will have more questions about that as we go along. All right, so let's dig in then. Let me see if I can get my little context to work, or my little clicker to work. Yes, okay. So this is how many Americans would encounter the Ludlow Massacre, through newspaper headlines such as this one that would blare out from newsstands and from front porches in April of 1914. So the Ludlow Massacre is an event that happens on April 20th, and word of it would spread during that day, and so news coverage would begin to appear in the American media the very next day, and in some cases even in the evening papers on April 20th. And so notice the portrayal of these events. Notice what this newspaper headline emphasizes. Women and babies slaughtered, war in Colorado. Very dramatic, really centering on the violence. And as Andy, when Andy mentioned my book title and earlier, the subtitle is that this is America's deadliest labor war. This is, Ludlow was sort of the culminating event in some ways of a strike in which between 80 and 100 people would perish on both sides. And so this is a really violent event. It's a really polarizing event. And it's one that's very much in the public spotlight, not only in Colorado, but nationwide. And in fact, it's even an event that would draw international attention. All right, so in terms of where all of this unfolded, I just want to give you a really quick geographical context. So if any of you have driven on I-25 between Denver and Albuquerque, you reach a spot, it's 15, 20 miles north of the New Mexico border, where you'll see signs for Ludlow, and you'll see signs for the Ludlow Massacre site. And so Ludlow is in south central Colorado, not all that far from the New Mexico border. Many people, incidentally, when they see that highway sign, assume that it must have been an Indian massacre. And that's one of the sort of ironies of Western history in a lot of ways, is that travelers would just assume that, oh, there's a massacre, we're in the American West, it must have been indigenous peoples who were perishing. And Ludlow, in fact, it was striking coal miners, their wives, their children, one militiaman, one bystander. And so this is a more detailed map of the southern Colorado coal fields. This was a major industrial area at the time. So this was the most important coal field between Illinois and California. So these were the largest coal producers in the entire American West. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. All right, now in terms of 1914, well, sorry, getting a little ahead of myself. Here you see a picture of Ludlow today on the left, not much there. And on the right, you see almost all of Ludlow in 1914. There really wasn't much there. It was a railroad junction, a depot, a couple of stores, a couple of dwellings. So Ludlow itself was never a major spot, and there were not very many miners who ever actually lived in the town of Ludlow itself. Now, in terms of the temporal context, 1914, this is when Henry Ford comes out with the Model T. It's when the first regularly scheduled passenger service in the United States begins on this airboat between St. Petersburg and Tampa. It's the year when Charlie Chaplin would come up with the tramp. Babe Ruth would actually be a pitcher at this point in his career with the Baltimore Orioles. And of course, most famously, from most historical viewpoints, the single most important event in 1914 was probably the beginning of World War I. Now, let's return to the southern Colorado coal fields, and let's really quickly talk about the major combatants in this labor war. So on the one side, we had the United Mine Workers of America. The United Mine Workers of America had been founded in 1890. They emerged out of several previous unions. One of the streams feeding into the UMWA was the Knights of Labor. At this time, the United Mine Workers was the largest union in the United States. There was no other union with as many members. So this is a union that's 400,000 members strong. Probably its most famous organizer at that time, and certainly the most famous organizer today, was the woman in the top right, Mary Mother Jones. So this is a big union. It's a nationwide union. And it's one that's very much in the public eye and had been for a couple of decades by the time we get to the Colorado Coalfield War. The other main set of combatants were the coal operators. On the left here, you see a man named John Cleveland Osgood. Osgood had risen up through the Colorado coal industry, and his major contribution probably was putting together a firm called the Colorado Fuel Iron Company, or CF&I. CF&I was the biggest coal company in the state. It was actually the largest industrial enterprise anywhere in the American West. It really was an octopus. It owned coal mines, it owned steel mines. It operated the massive Pueblo steel mills. And Osgood assembled this company, but in 1903, he loses control of it. He loses control of it to the Rockefeller family. So in the middle here, you see John D. Rockefeller Sr. Now, after that acquisition of CF&I by the Rockefellers, Osgood would actually get involved in a second coal company. And by the time we get to the 1913-14 Coalfield War, Osgood was heavily involved with his company, which was called Victor American. And then by that point, most of the involvement in Colorado Fuel and Iron had passed from John D. Rockefeller Sr., who you see in the middle here, to John D. Rockefeller Jr., who you see on the right. And I'll mostly just refer to him as Jr. So Jr. at this point was beginning to take the helm over the family's enterprises. So we've got the largest union in the United States pitted against the richest, the most powerful, and in many ways the most hated family in the United States on the other hand. And this is all happening in a state where the state militia had a long tradition of weighing in labor disputes on the side of corporations. So the state militia is another major player in this. And initially it's unclear whose side they're going to come down on, but most observers think that they're going to do what they've done in the past, which is they're going to help out the coal corporations. All right, now, so Andy, if I want to get this to start, can I just press this?
You know what, Thomas, what we probably should have done is I could have stripped that video out and we could have played it in the PowerPoint. I'm not sure if we can go live to it right now. Is that something that's going to be too much of a deal breaker for you?
No, it's all right. It's all right.
Sorry about that.
I could sing for all of you, but
well, let me try it quick.
actually, I will. We will win the fight today, boys. We'll win the fight today. Shouting the battle cry of union. We will rally from the coal mines. We'll battle to the end. And I won't punish you anymore with any more singing. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the tune because this song is set to the battle cry of freedom, which is important. So I want to give you a second to read over, and hopefully I've given you enough of the tune that you can sort of read it with the tune in your mind. But take a minute, read over this, and I want you to start pulling out themes and pulling out key phrases in here.
Thomas, this will give you a chance to get a drink of water and rest your voice. Thank you for the tune. Jason liked it, by the way. And so again, for all of you in the audience, if you would go through and sort of read these lyrics to you, the YouTube clip, the link that we have will take you to that if you choose to do it on your own. But pull out some themes and drop them in the chat box for us. We'd love to hear what you can analyze and interpret from those lyrics, what kind of themes you might see. Matthew, you see some allusions to the Civil War. Thanks, Matthew. What other kinds of themes do you see? Yeah, Matt Ingram chimes in that you see the disdain for the Baldwins, the hired thugs. Jeremy Shepard offers unity, law and rights. Writes Amanda Dennison. What other kinds of themes do you see? Rights and home, says Juliet. Tessia Park says freedom. Elizabeth Ducharme says hard sacrifice. Great job so far, folks. Add some more themes in there. I like the idea, Thomas, of all these people in their own homes right now singing this aloud.
I think Frank J. Hayes would be very pleased with that.
He would be. Death and freedom. And I'm going to put a comma in there for you, Daisy. I think there's one, death, comma, freedom, rather than death freedom. Thanks, Daisy. Daisy's at many of our webinars. I think she's from Los Angeles. Kayla Hudson, death is more acceptable than surrender.
I'm glad the melody is in your head.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm gonna start again. These are great. You all are doing a fabulous job. And so notice I love the Civil War connection, and that connection is both both musical but also Union, right? The battle cry, freedom, struggle, all of those things. And so there's a sort of invocation of this Civil War heritage. I really like what all of you are saying about sacrifice. And then that raises a really interesting question then. Who is sacrificed? Who has made those sacrifices? Are they referring to previous Union struggles? Are they talking about the workaday lives of miners and the workaday deaths in many cases of miners in the preceding decades? The reference to the Baldwins, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, who were often referred to by Union folks as thugs. They were notorious, particularly in West Virginia, for sort of being the armed, the sort of armed might for West Virginia coal corporations. They specialized in fighting the United Mine Workers. When if you have a chance to check out the YouTube, the video is a little bit weird, but the audio is awesome, and it's actually a contemporary Greek group. And this is a version of the song that was featured in a recent documentary. The Ludlow Massacre, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later, actually Ludlow has received a lot of attention from Greek historians and Greek activists in the last few years. All right, so this song then is written before the strike even begins, and Frank J. Hayes was the UMWA vice president. He had red hair, he was a fiery orator, and he pens this song in the lead up to the strike. And this strike took a lot of preparation. And so now I want to start talking about, and the connection to slavery, Richard, that's excellent, and we'll see more about that in a minute. So the document you're looking at now is from a newspaper called the Denver Express, and it was sort of we're talking about a period where American newspapers were very polarized, kind of like contemporary cable news. And this was a paper that was certainly kind of a left liberal paper. So here then we get a context for this song, and I want to paint the picture. Then this is an account then of an event called the Trinidad Convention. And the Trinidad Convention was a meeting of delegates from the United Mine Workers of America. Delegates came from across the Colorado coalfields. They filed into this theater in Trinidad, and for a couple of days, they talked. And what they were talking about was whether they should go on strike. And so I want you to read the top part of this newspaper account. The unanimous vote of the convention for a strike followed an impassioned speech by Mother Jones, and we'll look at part of that speech in a second. And I love this part. The announcement of the result was greeted by the miners with wild cheers. There's this tremendous excitement. Then, suddenly, silence fell over the hall. The delegates realized they had said the word that would throw 9,000 men out of work. They were awed by the greatness of the approaching struggle. Their faces became grave and stern. And so these guys are sort of standing at the precipice. They have just made votes that are putting all these people out of work. They're sort of crossing the Rubicon. They're throwing down the gauntlet. And look at who they're up against: the Rockefeller family, the Colorado National Guard. So no wonder there's this silence. There's this ominous feeling in the convention. It was actually a theater in Trinidad. And then all of a sudden, a man's voice from the rear of the hall began chanting the Colorado strike song. And so they kick into the lyrics that I just massacred, and then read a little bit lower. The song was taken up by row after row of the delegates. The men rocked in their seats as they sang it. The thunder of it shook the hall, and so the convention adjourned. And so these delegates literally bust out of the convention hall singing, and there were, by many accounts, more than 1,000 people waiting outside. This is a strike that literally begins with the song that we just read. Now, I want to go ahead to the next. Let's see. All right, I'm going to do these in reverse order. So this is a document then that relates to that relates to a critical thing that happened at that convention. So before the strike vote is made, there's this litany of grievances, and so this is this involves delegates from throughout Colorado coming up, stepping up to the podium and talking about things that they had witnessed, things that they had endured in the Colorado coalfields. This is a document that comes from a miner, an old Welsh-born miner named Thomas X. Evans, and this is from testimony that he gave in a conference with the governor of Colorado and with 3 coal company executives in November. So he's looking back from a couple months later. And Evans says, "You may not believe me, but I will tell you the truth. When I went to that convention, I never dreamt. Understand me, I'm telling you the truth. I was never looking for a strike. I did not believe it would come to that. I thought we would be able to come together. And I will say this, as true as I'm telling you now, that I failed to see where our officers encouraged the strike at all. But the evidence that was given by the delegates representing the different camps was heartbreaking. I know, gentlemen, that neither of you 3 would approve of what I heard. I do not believe you would for a moment." And I want you to keep reading from there, from the sentence, "Men gave evidence of how they were treated." And so this is a source that gives us a sense of what those grievances sounded like, what the sort of substance of those complaints that the delegates had, but it also gives you a sense of how other people in the room received that. We hear Evans claiming that he never thought that a strike would happen, but as he heard this litany, he was swayed by it. And this last line is particularly important, I think. "I know very well things have not been as they should be." And Evans actually, throughout this conference with the governor and with these coal company executives, he kept coming back to the same idea. And that idea was that the executives didn't know what was going on, that things weren't as they should be in southern Colorado. Now let's return to Mother Jones then. So this is back to that account from the Denver Express of the Trinidad Convention in September of 1913. And so this is narrating Mother Jones's speech, that fiery speech that occurred right before the vote that then silences the miners before they break out into song. And so I want you to read through this, and again, let's do the same thing with this document. I want to see what themes you break out and how you would analyze this document, what sorts of themes you would get your students to think about through this document, or that you would hope them to see in it.
Sometimes, Thomas, I find that the hearing your voice read this, particularly in this kind of format, might be helpful. Would you mind reading that for us, and then we'll invite the participants to bring out those themes?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to. I can't really embody Mother Jones in all her glory, probably, but I'll try. "Rise up and strike!" cried Mother Jones, the woman whom the coal operators of West Virginia blame for the victory of the miners there. "If you are too cowardly to fight for your rights, there are enough women in the country to come in and beat hell out of the operators for you. Strike and knock off the shackles of slavery. Strike and regain your manhood. Strike and stay with it until the last man of you drops into his grave, if need be. Strike and may God help you to hoist the banner of industrial freedom over Colorado's coal fields. And let me tell you one thing," the little old woman leaned tensely forward, "the man among you who will not protect his home, his own women folks, his own fireside, has no right to be on the free soil of America." All right, I like that, Matt. Calling them out by questioning their manliness. Katie, gender power and the notion of liberty. The threat to bring in women to do the work that, if the men weren't willing to do it, equating striking to freedom. We see this, so the strike then, industrial freedom is a really key phrase here as well. This idea then that this is a liberation movement. And that also connects to what we saw earlier regarding, sort of the Civil War looming over all of this. We see the theme of slavery again. All right, so, and this invocation, as Andrew says, of deeply held American ideals of freedom. All right, so not giving up. These are excellent, and so now I want you to imagine then this is how the strike gets moving. This is how it gets rolling, and let's analyze the demands that this convention would pass. This is the most direct evidence of what the strike was for, and so here then, this is the language that this is the actual resolution. A later copy of it, but this is the resolution that the delegates to the Trinidad Convention would pass. So, looking through here, I'm going to sort of read through these, and I want all of you to chime in with things that you notice as well. So first, we demand recognition of the Union. Now, let me explain the material in the parentheses on the side. This is a version of the strike demand that comes from a federal commission, the Commission on Industrial Relations, that investigated the strike afterwards in 1915. And so the material in parentheses is from the CIR and is sort of commentary on the status of these demands at the time they were made. So the strikers were demanding recognition of the Union. They wanted a 10% raise on a tonnage rate, and they also wanted day wages improved. Third, they wanted an 8-hour workday. Fourth, they wanted pay for all narrow work and dead work, and then they begin to specify what that is. This one's important, and we'll come back to it in a second. They wanted check weighman at all mines. They wanted the right to trade in any store and the right to choose their own boarding place and their own doctor. And then seventh, they wanted the enforcement of the Colorado mining laws and the abolition of the notorious and criminal guard system, which has prevailed in the mining camps of Colorado for many years. And then here's the closing plea. If you believe in the enforcement of law and a living wage, you will support the miners in this strike. So we can ask a few things here. We can say, well, what kind of strike was this then? And what kind of union was this? So we see bread and butter demands. We see, workers want shorter hours. They want better pay. But when you get further down the list, though, things get more complicated. So that fourth demand, that mention of dead work, is particularly interesting. It's tremendously ironic, but in coal mines, the work that people referred to as dead work was actually the work that you didn't get paid for, that you had to do to stay alive. So the context here is that coal miners were paid by the ton. They only got paid for coal that they removed. So all of the other labor that they needed to do, so for instance, setting up a prop to hold the roof up so it didn't fall on them and kill them. For all of that kind of work, cleaning out the room, trying to take care of the flow of air, they didn't get paid for that labor. And so this is what they're demanding here. They're essentially asking for a compensation system that made the mines safer for them.
Hey, Thomas, a quick question for you. When teams of miners went underground, did they get paid by the ton individually or as a team?
Yeah, so in Colorado at this time, they mostly worked in pairs.
Yeah.
And they would basically get paid as a team. And usually there was a sort of hierarchy among the two team members. There was usually one guy who was sort of the master miner and one who was more of an apprentice. So it was, and this is something we'll return to later, it's, coal mines up through the 1920s, for the most part, were quite old-fashioned. And so in a way, this is piecework, and in a way, it's a sort of master-apprentice system.
And do you have any, this can be anecdotal or maybe you have some data, but do you have any sense of how deadly this kind of work was?
It was tremendously deadly. So from the beginnings of record keeping in the coal industry in Colorado up through 1914, more than 1,700 miners would lose their lives in the coal mines. And so a little bit more about those accidents then. The majority of those deaths were actually in ones and twos, and they were from falls of rock, when the roof would fall on people or when the walls would fall. The most dramatic events, of course, were mine explosions. And in 1910 alone, there had been 3 mine explosions in the same county where Ludlow was located. So this is Las Animas County in extreme south central Colorado. Those 3 explosions killed more than 200 miners. And that unfolded in one county within a 10-month period.
Mike Cesario asks, to him at least, it appears that other states had much better working conditions for miners. First of all, is that true? Do you agree? And if so, did many miners just pack up and leave Colorado for these better conditions?
Yeah, so most states did have better working conditions, and so that was an option, and that's certainly one of the things then that's really important to try to explain. So the sort of the challenge that these, well, let me put it this way. So in trying to understand, well, what were these strikers thinking? One way to frame that is why would they think that they would have a chance against the Rockefellers and against Colorado Fuel and Iron, which was incredibly powerful? But then it's also important to ask, well, what other options did they have, and why did they no longer resort to those other options when they previously had? And that's a really tough question to answer. I mean, I don't have a really easy, compelling, and completely persuasive answer to that. I think the short answer is by this point, they maybe think back to that language of home in the Colorado Strike song. They were invested in southern Colorado. They'd made homes there. In the case of Hispano miners, for instance, miners of Latino descent from New Mexican communities in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, they had been in the area for a long time. They didn't want to move on, and so miners were very mobile, and they did move around a lot. And so then that is really one of the great puzzles of this strike then, and of the strikes that preceded it. Why at this time did these folks choose to hunker down and to engage in a struggle that they knew was going to be tremendously difficult? Okay, so the fifth demand, check weighman. So if you're being paid by the ton, you don't want to get cheated on your weights. And the company systematically cheated miners. So there were 2 kinds of tons. Miners got paid for a 2,000-pound ton, and the coal companies sold coal in tons of 2,200 pounds. Sorry, the other way around. The companies did it in their favor. So they actually basically skimmed a margin on that. So what the strikers were wanting here is they wanted people that they elected to monitor the weights, because the previous system, the company controlled that entirely. In the 6th demand, we see issues that are basically centering on company towns. And then the 7th demand, Colorado mining laws. Those mining laws have been reformed in response to the 1910 explosions. So the mining laws were actually pretty thorough, but the union members didn't feel that the laws were being enforced. And then we have this mention of the notorious and criminal guard system. And so here we really get at a claim that there was injustice, and a lack of freedom in the coal camps of southern Colorado. So this is a strike then it's not just a bread and butter strike. It's about a broader set of economic rights. It's about justice, and these themes that you all did such a wonderful job of fleshing out in terms of freedom and throwing off the shackles. All right. This is this image. I only want to talk about it really briefly, but these are union sort of organizers, and they're proselytizing. And it's fascinating that 2 of them are speaking to the same crowd, and they seem to be speaking at the same time. They're both gesticulating at the same moment. And what this speaks to, I think, is the multi-ethnic character of the strikers who were involved in this. By the 1910s, coal miners in Colorado were drawn from about 30 nationalities. It was a tremendously diverse labor force, and so it took this kind of multilingual organizing to bring these folks together. Could he be translating? That is a good question. It is possible, but we do know that there was a sort of delegation system. So one of the reasons that Greeks today are so interested in the Colorado Coalfield War is that a key figure, and the man whose murder really touches off the whole conflict on April 20th, was a Greek organizer named Louis Tikas. And so from other documentation, we know that there was a sort of a system of Greeks and Italians and other nationalities where those folks were charged by the Union with organizing among those folks. But it is possible that this is a scene of translation instead. Jacqueline, about West Virginia, that's a great point. West Virginia and Colorado were very similar, and they were very connected in all sorts of ways. And so for both the Union and for the Baldwin Felts, they're duking it out in West Virginia right before that, right before this strike. As you saw a little mention of him in a previous document, the Union actually mostly won that strike. And then you would have Union organizers and Baldwin Felts folks coming to Colorado from West Virginia, in many ways sort of recapitulating the struggle that they'd had there. So yeah, I don't want to, the question about how conditions in Colorado compared to other places, I think the bottom line is that coal mining was incredibly tough work all around the country at this point. And it was probably, Colorado's mines were, in terms of the fatality rates, were by most measures the most dangerous in the country, with the possible exception of Indian Territory, of Oklahoma. But all these mines were very, very dangerous. All right, so let's talk about the aftermath then of this strike call. And let's start with the strikers. So once these folks go on strike, most of them are living in company housing. So think about what happens then. If you live in company housing and you go out on strike, you're out of a place to live. The leases that the coal companies had miners sign usually provided for eviction within about 48 hours once they went on strike. And so there's mass evictions throughout the Colorado coal fields. And part of striking for the Union then is organizing places for the miners to go. So where do strikers go once they go out? There's about one of the earlier sources said 9,000 workers. There were actually 10 to 12,000 men participating in the strike. And then think about their dependents. So if we multiply that by their family members, we're talking about an event in which 40 to 60,000 people were probably involved. And strike participation was excellent. So most of the mines shut down, and most of the people living in company housing, virtually all of them, get evicted. And so where do they go? Some of them do go back out on the road, and the Union would help find them work in other places. Some of them would go to neighbors' places, if they had friends from the mines who had gotten out and bought ranches, or if they were from an Hispano community. So there's a sort of exodus out to farms and ranches in southern Colorado. Some of them would go to larger towns like Trinidad or Pueblo, or even up to Denver, where they might be able to find some work. For the most part, though, where the strikers would go were tent colonies. So there's actually about a dozen of these up and down the southern foothills of the Rockies. And the best known of these would be at Ludlow. Ludlow was a tent colony of about 1,200 people. So, this is a relatively small percentage of those participating in the strike overall. And as you can imagine, given that this workforce is so multinational and so multi-ethnic and multiracial, Ludlow drew people from many, many different populations.
Hey, Thomas. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Just a quick question. I don't want to take this too far astray, but do you have any sense of how many how many men from this area, particularly from this mining community, served in World War I? How much did that draw from this population?
Yeah, I mean, so the war. This is in April, and the war wouldn't really get underway until the fall.
Okay.
So later, later on, many of them would fight in World War One. I mean, more immediately, quite a few of them were actually veterans of the Balkan Wars.
Right.
Some of them were veterans of the Spanish-American War. Quite a few of them had fought in various. I mean, there were Italians, for instance, who'd fought in Africa. So they were many of them were actually experienced fighting men, but not yet in World War One.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and so here you see them kind of working out, doing gymnastics in the area. There's this sort of so these tent colonies had to become communities, and they were sort of instant communities. Now let's start talking a little bit about how things begin to get difficult and how they become increasingly violent. So the coal companies, they refused to countenance the possibility of signing union contracts. And so the coal companies claimed throughout that their big objection was to unionization. And when they explained this, which they generally didn't do to the public, but when they were in a piece of internal correspondence, which is included within the packet, you get a good explanation of this. They essentially didn't want to have to deal with union rules. They didn't want to lose control over underground workplaces. And the companies were very intransigent, so they were unwilling to grant much of anything in the way of strike demands. But unionization really becomes the fundamental sticking point and the fundamental point of conflict between the two sides. Now, the strike is violent even before it begins. The first death comes in August. The strike wasn't even declared until September. But there was a shooting in the streets of Trinidad in August of a union organizer by a thug, by a company thug. Now, as the strike, so as the tent colonies are constructed on land that in the case of Ludlow, this was land rented from an area rancher. The tents were bought from local hardware stores or shipped in from West Virginia from the last UMWA strike there. So by late September, early October, folks at Ludlow are kind of settling into a new routine. But Ludlow would be a flashpoint from the very beginning. And so this is a document from a woman named Pearl Jolly. And this is testimony that she would give following the Ludlow Massacre. But she's not talking about the Ludlow Massacre itself, actually. She's talking about the events of fall 1913. And Ludlow would be a flashpoint for conflict because of its location. It was actually, it was a very strategic location. It was next to branch railroad lines that came off from the main north-south railway lines up and down Colorado's Front Range. And those branch railway lines reached the coal mining communities in the hills above Ludlow. And so this camp was deliberately located in a site where the Union could use strikers to interdict the importation of strike breakers. Because the key for this strike was that the mines had to stay shut. If the mines stayed shut, then mine workers could essentially turn the lights off on all of Colorado and surrounding areas as well. They felt that they had tremendous power because their labor essentially produced the energy on which the entire region depended. And so that's what they're trying to, that's sort of the lever. That's how they have a chance of winning, is if they can keep the strike breakers out. Now this, let's read this document then. So from my first experience in the Ludlow tent colony, the gunmen, and here she means in particular the guards employed by coal companies, would come there and would try in every way to provoke trouble. They were trying to cause a battle between the miners and the gunmen, but we knew that, and we did not want to have any trouble. At one time, the gunmen came to the Ludlow tent colony just as near as they could get, fired 2 shots into the tent colony. Our men took their rifles and went to the hills, thinking that by so doing they would lead the fire that way and keep them from firing on the colony where the women and children were. There was no way to protect the women and children. After that, our men took and dug pits under the tents so that if the same thing should happen again, there would be some means of escape for those women and children. So in Pearl Jolly's account, there's a fuller version in the packet, she talks about the militia. So the militia comes into southern Colorado. They're ordered out by the governor. The governor was responding to a request from local law enforcement officials. And when the militia arrives, the strikers actually welcomed them. They, they had like a parade for them, and they hoped that these militiamen would be neutral. Now, one of the reasons that they hoped that is that the governor of Colorado at this time was a Democrat. He'd been elected with heavy support from labor. And so they thought that they had a pro-labor governor, and they thought that this time it might be different. But as fall sort of wore on, what you see in this document from Pearl Jolly is that conflict continues, and Ludlow is one of the places where this happens. So a really key thing here then is this is an explanation for why there are pits dug under the tents at Ludlow, and it's in those pits or in those cellars that most of the women and children who would die on April 20th. That's where they were, and the reason that those tents had been dug is essentially to shelter them from the gunfire that had become all too common even during the strike's early weeks. All right, now this brings us to the events of the Ludlow Massacre itself. And so I've sort of left off the story in fall, and the massacre doesn't happen until April. And in that intervening period, of course, many significant things happen. But one of the main ones, and one of the key things that we need to explain and try to understand, is how the militia turned from a relatively neutral force into a force that, by most appearances, was attacking coal miners and striking mining families, and that would be responsible for the deaths of so many people on April 20th. And that transition really happens for a couple of reasons. One is actually sort of the unintended consequences of a well-meaning action by a state official. And so the state treasurer, at one point in the strike, he refuses to continue paying the militiamen's salaries. So militia troops, militia officers, they no longer get paid by the state. And what happens is there's a sort of, there's a meeting in Denver of the state's economic elite, the big bankers, the smelter owners, and the coal companies. And the sort of capitalist elite gets together, and they decide, well, if the state's not going to pay the militiamen, we'll make sure that they get their money. So that happens, and has consequences. The other thing that's key for understanding why the militia becomes increasingly opposed to the strike is that this was a citizen force. This was the equivalent of the National Guard, and so most of the members could only serve 90 days of active duty. At that point, they had the choice whether they wanted to muster back in, and most of them didn't want to. This had been a violent strike already. These folks had other things to do. Oftentimes, they found it difficult to continue in the strike field. They didn't know. They either it was a difficult situation for many of them, and rather than continuing to put their lives at risk in a situation where many of them didn't really know where right or wrong lay, they decided to go back to their farms, go back to their clerking positions in Cripple Creek or in Denver, and they were replaced increasingly by mine guards, by folks who'd already worked as sort of hired guns for the coal companies. And so the composition of the militia really changes significantly by the time we get to the spring of 1914. Now, one other sort of complicating factor is that in March, and in particular in early April, things had actually become more peaceful in the coal fields. And in response to that peacefulness, the governor withdrew many of the militiamen. And this seemed like a positive sign, but its impact on the militiamen who remained was that it made them increasingly nervous, and it sort of upped their fearfulness. All right, now the events of April 20th, 1914, how this massacre happens, they're complicated and controversial. This is a really polarizing event, and so different primary sources will contain pretty different accounts of how everything goes down on April 20th. Louis Tikas, the Greek organizer, was essentially sort of interrogated. There's a scuffle. He's shot in the back. There's an attack on the tent colony. You see the strikers in the tent colony do the same thing that Pearl Jolly described them as having done the previous fall. So the men essentially take their weapons and they head for the hills. They try to divert the fire away from the tent colony. But what happens then is the militia descends on the tent colony itself, and the tent colony catches on fire under suspicious circumstances. Strikers would claim that this was intentional and that the militia had advanced and deliberately set fire to the tent colony. Most apologists for the companies and for the militiamen would say that, you know, lamps got toppled over and canvas tents are incredibly flammable. The tent colony would burn, and you know, over the course of the day, several people were killed by gunfire, including children, and one bystander and a couple of adult men. The real sort of, you know, the real tragedy of Ludlow, in many ways though, centers on this site here, and this is one of the cellars that had been dug the previous fall beneath one of the tents. And as the colony burned, it burned so hot. You can see that in the previous photo with the extent and severity of the destruction. The colony burned so hot that it actually sucked oxygen out from the cellars. And in one particular cellar, as you see in the caption from the time on this photo here, women and children were killed in significant numbers. And it's really what happens in this place that turns this into a massacre. This is what you'll see there today. This is a monument that the United Mine Workers would erect in 1918 at the site. So this is where you'll go if you get off the highway, if you get off I-25 and follow that. What you see here is a, you know, sort of an attempt to commemorate those who fell at Ludlow, and you see the depiction of women, men, and children. And that's really one of the critical things about this strike is that it involves, you know, entire families. Since the time of the Ludlow Massacre, it would receive attention from a whole host of important figures in American history, from Howard Zinn to Woody Guthrie, from George McGovern to Upton Sinclair. And so all of them have produced really rich, but also sometimes problematic, you know, songs and books on Ludlow and on the Colorado Coalfield War. Now, those stories that those folks I just showed you told about Ludlow, for the most part, they would sort of they would emphasize the lead up to Ludlow. But one of the really interesting things is what happens next. So in the wake of Ludlow, I mean, as the tent colony is still smoldering, striking miners are heading for the hills. They're uncaching weapons that they had hidden from the militia because the governor had issued a disarmament order. They're taking up those weapons. Many of them are drawing upon that military experience that they already had. And they're heading into the foothills around the coal fields of southern Colorado, and they're fighting. They're taking up arms, and then meanwhile, you know, telegrams are coming into Union headquarters from Italian miners in Louisville in northern Colorado, from Italian miners in Wyoming. They're even getting telegrams from places like Illinois. There are people from all these places are saying, we're ready to go. Say the word, we'll come out to Colorado, we will fight on your behalf. And so there's really an uprising, an armed uprising that follows Ludlow. And this is an event that would be referred to at the time as the 10 Days War.
Thomas, I'm going to interrupt you briefly. Mike is going to put you on the spot, and he's going to ask, of the two possible causes of the fire, which one do you think is most likely? Ginger Park, who is also in Colorado, she says she believes the strikers. What do you think?
Oh, the cause of the fire. I mean, I think the militiamen. You know, I don't think that the strikers would have set the fires. You know, I think that the militiamen may well have done it. You know, this is a many of the militiamen involved in the attack on the tent colony had worked as mercenaries. So I mean, these guys had done a lot of fighting. Most of them had done a fair amount of killing. They were pretty hardened characters by this point in the strike, and so I certainly wouldn't put it past them. I mean, one of the explanations that company apologists, or sorry, that company advocates would put out there was that the strikers were using like exploding bullets, and that the exploding bullets could have caused the fire. I don't think that that's very likely. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe there's some chance it was an accident, but I think it's probably more likely that the militiamen did it intentionally. There was a lot of bad blood by that point.
Thank you. And Jason has a question. He asks, in the pre-reading, it said the memorial was defaced. Do you have any idea why, and why in the fashion that it was?
Not really. Nobody knows for sure. I mean, the context there is that there was labor conflict in the Pueblo steel mills at that point in 2003, and so it seems like it was probably a sort of anti-union move in response to that local context, but nobody really knows for sure. I mean, it was a sort of beheading, and I don't really know what to make of that. I could speculate, but unfortunately, the perpetrators have never been caught. Okay, so this is a photo. Then this is, you might recognize it from the cover of Killing for Coal, and it's a great photo, I think, but more importantly, it's a revealing photo. So these are strikers who are. This is a photo that's taken on April 29th, and this is 9 days after the massacre. And these guys, I mean, one of the things about sort of treating this as a one of the important insights about paying attention to the 10 Days War is that for me, it sort of shifts how we think about the miners and how we think about the events of April 20th. Because what we see here then is that these guys are not beaten, right? They're very much defiant. We see that they would continue to fight, and they would actually these guys are returning from a last set of attacks. They know that the U.S. Army is on its way, and they were unwilling. They knew that they weren't going to fight against regular U.S. troops, so they were trying to get in as much damage as they could at the very end. And so this 10 Days War would actually result in about 30 deaths. The miners would blow up a few mine tunnels. They would decimate a couple of company towns. And so in some important ways, the strikers would give almost as good as they got, by some measures more than they got in the course of this 10 Days War. And in response to this fighting in southern Colorado, that's when Denver club women, they march on the governor's on the state capitol. They insist on seeing the governor, and they essentially force Governor Elias Ammons to telegraph Woodrow Wilson. And it's really the actions of those women that bring peace to the coalfields. And one of the really critical things here then to understand is that a couple of days into the 10 Days War, the Union stops supporting this uprising. And in fact, union organizers, the union leaders in Colorado, were hustling around the coalfields in automobiles, begging essentially the strikers to stop fighting, to stand down. But the strikers wouldn't do it. And so what I think is really important about this then is that the strikers were fighting for the Union, but the Union wasn't the only thing that they were fighting for. And so, this was a strike that had become about unionization, but it was also it was also about much more. And so I want to talk a little bit, I know we don't have very much time left, but I want to talk a little bit about what these men were fighting for, and what the sort of underlying causes of this conflict were. And so for me then, this brings us to three questions that I think are really critical. And these are the three questions that really frame Killing for Coal, the book. And so if you want to learn more about any of this, please do, turn to a copy of the book, check it out from the library. It's out there. So these are all things that I develop in a lot more depth there. But the first question is, why was coal worth fighting for in the first place? this is Colorado. Isn't this a gold mining area, a silver mining area? Isn't coal something that's in, Pennsylvania or West Virginia? So we need to understand why coal mattered in the American West. Secondly, there's this really important question then of, since this was such a diverse place, how did people who were so different from each other periodically come together and wage struggles against coal corporations and the state? And then finally, how did strikes change over time? And most importantly, how did strikes become more violent over time? So the first question here, the first part here is really like, how does Colorado become a fossil fueled place? And the really important thing here is that everything in the economy in the late 19th and early 20th century depends on coal. The railroads have to have coal. On the right here, you see the steel mills in Pueblo, which were enormous. The smelters in Colorado, which were essential for turning ore into silver and gold, operated on coal. Mines like those you see here, these are the Leadville silver mines. Look at all the smoke in here. They need coal for pumps. They need coal for fans. They need coal to drive the machines that they're increasingly using to bring ore out of the ground. Urbanites are burning coal in the form of, to generate electricity so that they can have buildings like this one. This is the Denver Gas and Electric Company with its show of sort of, gratuitous light bulbs, this command of energy. And so we see rapidly escalating per capita coal use in Colorado during these decades. And coal is underpinning the growth of the regional economy. It's the linchpin of the entire economy. It's driving widespread environmental changes, economic changes, social and political changes. And it's really important to realize here that the benefits and the costs of this coal-powered economy were borne very unequally. And so this is a nice contrast, I think. On the one hand, we see a working class Chinese American family. They've got a stove that seems to be so leaky that we see smoke in the picture, although it's possible that that's actually deterioration of the negative, but I like to think of it as smoke. We've got folks who have very little access to energy. They don't get to use very much of it. What they do get to use, it's in a dirty form. The places they live had more pollution. And then on the right, we see a more middle upper class family. The blocks in this picture spell gas is nice. They had access to a cleaner form of coal. They lived in more suburban neighborhoods where the impact of a coal-powered economy was less severe. In fact, coal was so important in Colorado by the time of the Colorado Coalfield War that per capita coal use there much exceeded, for instance, per capita coal use in the United States today. It blew out coal use in Victorian, in sort of Dickensian Britain. Australia is the highest coal-consuming country in the world today on a per capita basis, and you'll see that Colorado in 1910, folks are burning much more coal per capita even than that. And this brings me to a really important thing then, and this is what I call the irony of coal. The irony of coal is really simple. It's that coal was essential for a mechanized economy, and yet the extraction of coal through the 19-teens pretty much depended on hand labor. The mines themselves were almost unmechanized. And so if you wanted to extract more coal out of the ground, if you wanted to sustain growth in per capita coal use of this sort, and note, Colorado's population is skyrocketing during these decades. And so the companies have to put more and more people underground. And they turn to a larger and larger, to a larger and larger, more and more scattered set of labor providing regions. And this is how the coal fields become so diversified. And so that's the second big mystery here. How do people who are so different come to believe that they have something in common? And this is a big story, and it's one I can't really do much justice to at all in the context here. It's one of the main questions I'm trying to examine in my book. But I do want to mention a few things. One is that they do this not just once, but repeatedly. About every decade, there's a major strike in the southern Colorado coal fields. So these happen every decade. Each of these strikes, there's sort of a different ethnicity that is targeted in news coverage as the rabble rousers. By 1914, it would be the Greeks, Louis Tikas and other Greeks. But in earlier strikes, it had been other ethnicities and nationalities. There's a real change. Oh, sorry, Andy.
I was going to say, and I apologize for interrupting, is it your sense that in each of these strikes, they're asking for essentially the same kinds of demands?
That's critical, and that's actually something I'll get to in a minute.
Okay, sorry. Just table that then.
Well, let me just, I can say what the difference is now and then try to explain it in a minute. So if you read the strike demands from the late 19th century, it's all about workplace issues. And then when you get into the 20th century strikes, there's this expansion. There's mentions of company towns. There's a fuller claim that this is about civil rights and freedom and all of that. And so narrower, disputes that were mostly about narrow workplace issues become much larger struggles in the 20th century. That's the basic difference across time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for me, the answer to how these, why do strikes persist? Why do different ethnicities come together, and why do different groups of people take the lead in these strikes over time? In a lot of ways, the big commonality, the most important commonality, I think, across these decades actually centers on the mines themselves and the work that miners are doing underground. And so I make an explanation for this that's really about what I call mine workscapes, the sort of everyday interactions between miners and the earth underground, and work cultures. And it's really this that breeds this, there's this rugged masculinity, there's a sense of autonomy and craft pride, there's a sense of tremendous and shared danger, there's solidarity, and then there's also an inclusiveness. All of these things characterize the work culture of Southern Colorado coal miners, and they're fundamental for how these folks periodically assemble these movements. All right, now the last part of this story, the third question, really centers on why does the violence become more severe? And for me, the critical thing here really begins in the 1890s. There's a strike in 1894, and to give you a really quick version of what happens, the strikers go on a march, and that march then, begins in Fremont County near Canyon City. And the miners who are on strike, they march literally from mine to mine, and they use persuasion and sometimes violence to get the miners working at those places to come out. This is a trek, this is a march that covers about 80 miles, and it results in quite a successful strike. In the wake of that strike, coal company leaders notice a couple of things. They noticed that workers did a pretty good job of organizing, but they weren't able to penetrate places that were called closed camps. Closed camps are what you might think of as a traditional company town. And so in the wake of this 1894 strike, the coal companies actually, they begin building a full-on company town system, and that hadn't previously existed in Colorado. Their show place for this company town system is going to be Redstone, which you see on the left. This is a place up near Aspen. It's beautiful. And they put a lot of money into it. John Cleveland Osgood actually had a mansion and a game park on the border of it. But most of the company towns look more like the one on the right. This is Rouse. This was one of the sort of prototypes for the new company town system. And the companies use their, Colorado Fuel Iron produced its own magazine. And in that magazine, they would actually tout the company towns as a benefit to workers. And in some ways they were, the quality of the housing stock probably increased. But the unintended consequence of the company town system was that previously, most miners in Southern Colorado, they lived in houses that they owned themselves. They did business with independent storekeepers. They lived in towns where nobody, where there was no sort of company deciding who would control the church or the medical system. The company town system, though, really centers grievances in the coal companies themselves. And the coal companies really use these new company towns deliberately and often pretty coercively to try to keep unions out. And so these new company towns had barbed wire fences, they had gates. The governor of Colorado couldn't get into these company towns when he tried during the 1913-14 strike. And so, yeah, I mean, as Ginger's saying, the company towns were an attempt to really ratchet down the control on workers. And in some ways it worked, but in some ways it set the stage for these more intense conflicts in the early 20th century. And it's a key part for understanding why the strikes became broader based, and why they became more intense, and why they became more violent. And so, what I've tried to do here then is give you both walk you through a set of documents that give you a pretty full sense of what happens in 1913-14 and the reasons behind that. But then I also wanted to expand the view and look at the bigger factors at play in at least a sort of sketchy form. So I think at this point, Andy, I'm done with the sort of presentation part, and I wanted to see what questions folks had.
Fantastic, thank you. We do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to try to get to them in order. Matthew, I'm going to save yours to the very end. Kayla Hudson asks, would the work culture of rugged masculinity have been, pardon me, it just scrolled out of my view. Would they, that's right, rugged masculinity have been why Mother Jones emphasized that the miners must strike to prove their manliness, or was it just a common argument she made in regards to other strikes?
Both of those are true. So, I mean, I think the key thing here is that Mother Jones was, she mostly worked as an organizer for the United Mine Workers. And so organizing coal miners was her specialty. And this rugged masculinity, this was important and characteristic of coal mining work cultures across the country. And so, yeah, I mean, this is something that she was very used to playing off of and using as a lever. So this, if you look at her speeches from Illinois or West Virginia or Pennsylvania, she would be using that same claim in most cases.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Here's a question from Brennan Ivy. He asks, how did the coal miners union support or compensate families of coal miners who lost their lives?
Right. So this is a really good question. For the most part, the union. So this gets into a couple things that I didn't mention. One is that the union had been suppressed in Colorado, and so every time the union lost, union members were blacklisted essentially, and found it very hard to work in the state, particularly people who'd taken any sort of leadership role in the strikes. For the most part, the companies were noted for firing people who were union members. And so there's very little union membership. And so, when there are mine disasters or even falls of rock, the union itself during this period was not compensating miners in Colorado for the most part, because most of them weren't union members. They wanted to be, it seems, but they couldn't be. And so more important were mutual aid associations, which were often ethnically based. Miners would take out insurance policies. And then also, in some cases, the companies would voluntarily offer some measure of compensation.
Great, thank you. Matt Ingram has several questions. I'm going to put them together. Can you speak to Rockefeller Jr.'s role in the post-Ludlow situation? And then he expands on that a little bit by saying that he has heard or read that Jr. went to Ludlow almost at rise of life in danger to console or meet with the workers. Is that true?
Yeah, so Rockefeller Jr., he begins the strike with, the Rockefellers they're the controlling shareholders. So they're not officers in the company. And so their stance at the beginning of the strike is, our officers in Colorado are in charge. They know what they're doing. They're closer to the situation, and it's their responsibility. And so so Junior at the beginning of the strike essentially does all he can to just ignore it. He really doesn't seem to want to know about it. After Ludlow, he gets called in to testify. Upton Sinclair leads marches against the Rockefeller mansion at Kycut. At that point, Junior is really forced into action, and initially he was very refractory. I mean, he denied, any sort of validity to the strike. He portrayed all of the union's claims as completely groundless. And the key event here then is that Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family hires William Lyon Mackenzie King, who had been the Canadian Minister of Labor and would go on to be a Canadian Prime Minister, to consult. And and William Lyon Mackenzie King basically convinces Junior that there was some basis to the strike and that the Rockefellers needed to change their ways, that they needed to reform CF&I. And so Rockefeller does have this kind of change of heart. Now, you'll see, like in the sort of stories of 20th century history that the Rockefeller family will tell themselves, they often use Ludlow as a key moment for distinguishing, when the evil old days of John D. Rockefeller Sr. ended and when the sort of modern days of the Rockefeller Foundation began and the Rockefeller family. It's always, more complicated than that. Rockefeller would return to the coal fields in 1915. He would tour around, and it was a very it was a tense situation, but he actually seemed to be fairly skilled as a conciliator, and by that point he had pretty good press folks as well. So this was often portrayed as a moment of reconciliation. It's less clear how miners themselves and how former strikers themselves would have looked upon his visit.
Thank you. Matthew Gatos asks, and this may be getting a little outside of your expertise or not, but it's impossible not to try to draw some parallels or some connections with contemporary coal mining. Do you have any sense, Thomas, about whether coal mining is still a viable energy option in 2019? And are there coal miners standing by to get their jobs back? How do you sort of view the current landscape or workscape of the coal mining industry?
Whew, yeah, that's a huge one.
Yeah.
I think in terms of, let me start with workscape. I think in terms of workscape, it's changed so much with mine mechanization and with the huge switch to open pit mining and the regional changes in mining, and the anti-union activity of most of the larger coal operators. And so I think that so one way that I would explain what seem to be fairly different politics among coal miners today compared to those in 1913, 1914 really would be that the workscape is so different. These guys are operating huge machines. The fellowship is different. The everyday experience is very different. As far as is coal still a viable energy source? There's still plenty of it. So it's viable in the sense of being available. In terms of it being a good choice, moving forward, given concerns about greenhouse gases and all of the other problems that burning coal introduces. I think that the personally, I think that America remains more dependent on coal than it should be. You'll notice hesitation here, and my big hesitation here really centers on workers who remain dependent on the work that coal provides. And so, I think that they need other things to do, and those other things need to provide not only the wages, but also the sense of meaningful work that the coal industry actually did provide for a lot of its history. And so I think that there's, I think that this requires a messier solution than most of the contemporary political positions would allow.
Great, thank you for tackling that tough one. I've got one last question for you. I'm going to forward through, I think you had a couple of last slides here to this slide. One last question for you, Thomas, and that is, you've got teachers from all over the country. It's been a fantastic webinar. I think all of them can see the perspective that you've offered in this environmental case study. But give us a takeaway. What from your perspective, as someone who's written about this and researched it and knows it well, what would be your takeaway for them and how they can apply this to a deeper and richer understanding of some piece of the world that we live in? What's your takeaway for them? How can this connect, do you think?
Yeah, I think it connects in a lot of ways. So one is thinking about the energy sources, the energy systems, and the sort of the kinds of environmental extraction that continue to make our modern lives possible. So one of the things that I think that this really offers is an opportunity to think about how the stuff that we use, including the energy we use, connects us to other places and to other people that we too easily ignore. And so, I mean, all the time we're interacting with other people in other places through our consumption. And yet it's sort of the nature of a modern economy that most of those connections are obscured for us, or that we don't even recognize them. So I think there's a real opportunity here to get students thinking about where does their energy come from, who helps to produce it, and what are the consequences of those systems that make that available. I think that all of this is also a great example of why labor unions are important, and of why the United States needed to shift to a more union-friendly economy by the 1930s. And again, this is a complicated matter, right? We could talk about both the limitations of the New Deal where labor was concerned. We could talk about the problems with corruption and mismanagement and a lack of democracy in certain unions at certain points in history. But certainly a pre-union world was a pretty grim place for workers, and we see this in the Colorado Coalfield Wars. So those are my two big takeaways, I think.
It's fantastic. Thomas, I want to thank you for leading our conversation tonight and bringing your scholarship and expertise to the teachers that have participated. I want to thank you for being a part of our webinar series.
Oh, thanks all of you. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of it. And yeah, feel free to shoot me an email if you have other questions or if I can help you in any way.
And I also want to thank all of our participants for joining. Again, we have recorded tonight's session, and it will be online within about 48 hours or so you can go back through and maybe linger on some of the comments and some of the documents. I personally really appreciated the way that Thomas brought so many primary sources into the conversation. He really provided evidence for his argument. And I think one of the things that we at the National Humanities Center try to model is that kind of evidentiary argument and the use of artifacts, objects, documents, images, photographs, etc., as the stories are told. Please follow all of our social media to get updates on upcoming activities, both online and face-to-face. You can follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. You can also, again, use our YouTube channel to look at previous webinars. Tonight, once I shut the room, you will be asked to take a survey, and once that survey has been completed, you'll be able to download your certificate. I'm pretty sure that you won't get that invitation, though, until I close the room. So typically I wait just 4 or 5 minutes, a couple of minutes to let everybody say goodbye, and then I'll close the room and you'll be prompted for your certificate. I hope to see all of you at our next webinar. This is scheduled for Tuesday, March the 19th. We'll be working with Matthew Pansiera from Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. This will be an exploration of Roman daily life. And I hope all of you have a wonderful day at school tomorrow. Thank you again. We'll see you at the next session of the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.